Happy Africa Day and welcome to the first virtual Breaking Down Borders Africa Youth Summit, hosted in partnership with the South African Human Rights Commission. Over the past 4 years, we have hosted youth from over 26 African countries in the diaspora. This virtual meeting, like our previous summits, is to create an inclusive space for African youth to engage on collective youth activism towards the continent's sustainable development. This year's summit is hosted under the theme Together Apart towards collective youth activism. And under this theme, we hope to engage on a collective and inclusive response to the current pandemic and other issues affecting the African continent. Over the next 5 days, we'll be hosting sessions relating to youth activism for disaster response, the impact of COVID-19 on youth livelihoods, on women and girls, on human rights, as well as youth well-being and mental health. Our opening session today, under the theme Youth Activism for Disaster Response, will be facilitated by Patrick K. Stevenson. Patrick Stevenson is an economic consultant with a keen interest in the continent's in Africa's development. He has consulted with institutions in the public sector and the INGO space, institutions such as the World Bank and UNDP, amongst others, and is currently the head of research at the Imani Center for Policy and Education. As a broadcast journalist for GH1 and Business Edition Radio Accountability and drive advocacy for key policy reform in Ghana, as well as discussed issues relating to key sectors of the Ghanaian and African economy. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Ntabiseng, for that introduction. At a point, I was wondering whether you were talking about me, but thank you so much. And welcome to all the panelists to this very exciting conversation. I think that this discussion is one of the most important things that should be happening on the African continent at the moment. And so, to my panelists who I'll be introducing shortly, I think you're all welcome. The topic or the theme that we have been tasked with trying to unpack, as far as the development of the African continent is concerned, on Africa Day, is one that is of extreme importance, and the theme is together apart and the youth, activism for disaster response. And I think that is an extremely important, topical subject today on the African continent. And one of the reasons that is one of the reasons why I think this is of tremendous importance is because you look across the continent of Africa today, if not for anything at all, the possibility of finding very young people in every aspect of our lives, I think, is quite high. Yet, the kind of leadership that we have politically and economically across the continent, a lot of that seems to be, for a very, want of a better phrase, very old people, right? And so how do we as young people who have actively been involved in our various spheres of endeavor try to unpack what our responsibilities really look like as far as Africa today is concerned within the context of the response to COVID-19. This is also important because the struggle for Africa's emancipation, when you think of leaders like Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and the like, they were doing these things when they were in their early 30s, mid 30s. Some of them even way below that. I mean, the likes of Thomas Sankara, for example. I mean, they were pushing things on inclusivity of women when they were very young. It shows that if the continent should move forward, we have a certain responsibility. And so that is some sort of a context for this conversation we are going to have. What it is that the African youth today can do within the context of providing, credible and creative responses to COVID-19, leveraging our various strengths in the area of activism. And so that's the conversation. The mode of our discussion is going to be a Q&A session. So it's not to suggest that I have all the questions. I think we have some audience as well that will have their own questions regarding the theme and the subject, and those questions will come and we'll take them as and when we get them towards the end of the conversation. But to introduce the panelists, We have an amazing panel, I should say. I think the diversity of the panel as well is quite interesting in terms of where backgrounds are, right? And so I'll start off right by the very first panelist, who's Lennon Munyae. And Lennon is a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations graduate from the University of Witwatersrand, and works with the African Peer Review Mechanism. And this mechanism is a mutually agreed instrument that African countries use to measure or assess their development, particularly on the mobilization and engagement of youth along the shared and common values of the continent. And I do recall a number of reports that back in the day were led by General Obasanjo himself and a few others regarding this mechanism. I do recall as well my former president Jacob Kufuor was quite instrumental as well on this. So Lennon, you're welcome.
Thank you, Patrick, for the warm introduction, and happy Africa Day to the listeners as well.
Right. So besides Lennon, we have Tanya Lemond, who's based in Mauritius. She's a lawyer by profession and a social activist at heart, that is. She's the legal lead of the Reform 53 campaign of the Commonwealth Youth Gender and Equality Network under the Royal Commonwealth Society. She sits on the advisory board of the steering of Greatness Foundation, a global peace chain, international human rights advisory council. She works also on the Agents of Peace, Kenya and Svikers. She's the founder and country director of Mauritius chapters of the African Network of Youth Council, and she has a lot of credentials in terms of women empowerment and engagement of young people in the area of business and the area of entrepreneurial development. Tanya, you're also welcome. Very interesting and exciting to have you here.
Thank you, Patrick. And may I add to everyone that's here, we're all jealous of your background at the moment. I'm from Mauritius and I so miss the beach at the moment.
Thank you very much.
People in the audience are telling me that they're missing the beach. So.
Well, it's part of feeling youthful and getting the brain to relax under such stress, right? Okay. Now, besides Tanya, we have Thomas Simbe, who is a librarian. So again, shows you the diversity of the panel that we have all across the African continent, and he's an enthusiastic Pan-Africanist, very useful characteristic of a young person in today's Africa. Currently, he's a teaching and research assistant in the Department of Political Science, the University of Liberia, and he's deeply interested in issues of governance, inclusive development, policy making. That's something we share in common, and policy research and political analysis. Additionally, he's a passionate socio-political advocate with keen interest in youth participation, mentorship, and academic development, and he's part of a number of political science associations across the world. Thomas, you're also welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. It's a great pleasure, and happy Africa Day to all our great participants all across the continent of Africa and in the diaspora. It's my great delight. I'm absolutely pleased.
Thank you very much for making time to join us, Thomas. And finally, we have on the panel Alan Tumbo, who's an ardent advocate for human rights and a passionate Pan-African as well. He has spent more of his career working on human rights, particularly the right to equality and non-discrimination. He currently works as a research advisor to the Commissioner Malati at the South African Human Rights Commission. In his capacity, Alan is currently leading a project to establish a monitoring mechanism to monitor the implementation of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in South Africa. And he was selected as part of the 2019 cohort of the Obama Foundation of Young Leaders. So again, another interesting background, this time looking at how we can rope people with disabilities and drive human rights issues across the African continent as well. Alan, thank you very much for the work you do, and you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Greetings to everyone and happy Africa Day.
Thank you very much. Now that we have the panel out of the way, to the audience, at the end of this conversation, there'll be a period of about 15 minutes that we may take questions and answers. So feel free to put these questions and answers through as you can. For those watching us live on Facebook and other social media handles, it is important for you to equally contribute to the conversation by sending your questions through, and we shall take them as far as time will permit. Without much ado, we'll get into the conversation proper. And I think it is good we start with, the person who seems to works in the area of reviewing what development across the African continent really is, and how the African youth have been mobilized towards driving the development agenda of the African continent. And here I'm talking Lemond, right? So Lemond, you may start off the conversation for us. In terms of activism and the work you do with the APRM, it will be interesting to know what the reaction of the various countries and various youth groups involved in activism really looks like within this time where we are confronted with this global challenge that Africa is responding to in different ways. What really does that narrative look like?
Thank you so much, Patrick. Look, the pandemic, it's almost 2 months now since it was announced, it reached the shores of the continent. And to be honest, a lot of commentators, they expected to see body bags in the streets of Africa. That's one article I read. But so far, I can tell you that I think a lot of African countries have responded positively in stopping the pandemic from taking the lives of people. And young people in particular have been very instrumental. Young people have led in terms of the innovation. We see a lot of innovation from across all African regions, young people coming up with different types of masks, different types of sanitizers. We've also seen African young people being in front of the advocacy in terms of sensitizing African people about the disease, as well as young people actually helping in delivering food, as well as basic services. So when we say young African people are the future of tomorrow, this pandemic has actually shown that we're the leaders of today, and that demographic dividend that we've been talking about for a very long time, it's being showcased right now on the continent. So before I continue saying anything else, I would like to actually appreciate the efforts of various young people, particularly those ones that are in the front line. Young doctors, young people that are leading in the military, in the police. They're at the front line, and we should salute their effort.
Well, thank you very much, Lennon. And I'm going to come back to some very important points you raised there. That different youth groups are involved in different solutions on the front lines, right? And again, it comes back to some of the things we have always known, that African youth would typically get involved in the solution provision, but our ability to provide these solutions is based on a certain ecosystem that has been designed that is either accommodative of our efforts or not. So it's almost to say that we are almost caught up finding second best solutions to problems that exist, which maybe leadership may not have. So I will come back to that conversation. But I'll pick up from where you just left off and go to Tanya, right? Now Tanya, your work involves dealing with different groups, particularly women, and empowering them in different ways. We know that under the current constraints, the people you find on the front end, either in the provision of food, trying to protect their families and ensuring that social distance mechanisms, are completely followed in the home. And outside of that, those even at the front line, medical doctors, nurses, and other health professionals, majority of them happen to be women. And that's what the data appears to suggest. Have we as a continent and as young people created that narrative that makes it relatively easy for those with this profile to actively engage in the solution provision at the local and at the regional and continental level?
I would say the COVID-19 pandemic, despite its tragic consequences, has provided an unprecedented opportunity for innovation and resourcefulness within the African continent. Despite the fact that a lot of crises have been exacerbated, we've seen rises in domestic violence, child marriage, female genital mutilation, but we have had those crises have always been existent, but the COVID-19 pandemic has shed light on those, on how severe it is. And now is the time for young people to push governments for changing those policies to bring about more protective laws for girls and women. Because I can see from my experience that young people are actively working at grassroots level to protect those on the front lines, to protect, like, for example, Safe Engage Foundation in Kenya is working actively on the ground to protect young girls from female genital mutilation. But at the moment, because of the COVID-19 lockdown, their operations have had to stop. So what they have done is diversify their operation, to distribute sanitizer kits, to distribute food packages. So there has been a resourcefulness in terms of activities on the part of African youth. I would say, though, that although we should see how other continents are implementing those solutions, the methods that they're implementing, we should take those as a source of inspiration. I wouldn't say it's always wise to copy them exactly. We should always adapt it to our specific context. So I have seen in situations where in remote areas where they don't have running water, young people have implemented systems where people would be able to wash their hands. So there is this resourcefulness that is present, but unfortunately, indeed, like you pointed out, there is a lack of support at times for the initiatives. And as young people, we're often dismissed because of our inexperience. So sometimes it's difficult for them to apply for grants, or even if they do apply, it's difficult for them to receive those grants. But I feel like the COVID-19 pandemic has also highlighted the need for funding for young people's organizations. So now we have seen an emergence of grants and sponsorships for projects specifically designed by young people. So although we are still in a very difficult phase in terms of surmounting the crisis, I feel like we are on the right track at the moment.
Thank you very much for that reaction. But I'll follow up quickly on a point you made, regarding the fact that the pandemic as it is today has almost thrown light on challenges and issues such as domestic violence, etc. There's always a saying that in every challenge or in every difficulty there's an opportunity. Do you feel that in the presence of that challenge, where a lot more people are now staying home, so if somebody was domestically being abused, for example, as a young person or as a woman, then there's a tendency for that to be more. Do you feel that under the current dispensation, there's an opportunity for solutions to be provided with, that addresses those problems currently? That, either some people have developed some tools for women, for example, who get, abused domestically, to be able to leverage the existing technology system to get these things addressed. So do you feel that we have that space now to address some of those constraints?
Absolutely. In fact, I have seen people who have put up hotlines for women who are in abusive situations so that they can call for help, because now they cannot go out to support centers. We have had situations where there has been a sort of neighborhood solidarity for women who are victims of domestic violence, so that we can adapt to this lockdown situation. Unfortunately, though, the situation has always been prevalent. It's just because that we have the COVID-19 pandemic at the moment that more light and media attention is being thrown on it. So I feel like this, like you said, is the appropriate opportunity for us to tackle those challenges at the moment, so that we can absolutely, completely eliminate them right now, so that in the future we can have better situation for women and girls whenever, if it happens that they have to stay within the house.
Thank you very much. So, Alan, you're the human rights activist, right?
Yes.
And that, in my opinion, comes with a lot of responsibilities, whether you're talking economic rights, fundamental human rights, political rights, etc. But I think what is equally interesting about what you do is the focus on people with disabilities. Somehow, it will come across as though the thinking fray for providing solutions in the current dispensation that the continent finds itself, I hardly hear a focus on that group that, ordinarily is marginalized anyway, right? In terms of the distribution of resources, whether it's in healthcare and education or whatever it is, that group is already marginalized. Now, we have a constraint that is confronting everybody. It would appear there will be further marginalization of that group. So that if, for instance, we're saying, okay, people have got to start working from home or, going to school, having the online education, the person who ordinarily maybe was blind or could not, see properly or was visually impaired or it is not fully able in certain dispensations, we haven't provided resources that actually connects them to the emerging concept. Will that be a fair observation? And how does that tie in with our values of Africans and the objectives and goals we set for ourselves, that we're not leaving anybody behind?
Yes, so it is true. The current situation we're in is one which really works to marginalize people with disabilities a lot more, right? What our monitoring is showing us is that there are certain rights that people with disabilities are experiencing and being affected by during this time, right? That includes access to information, for example. Many of us have been watching our presidents and ministers giving announcements on what the responses and interventions will be with regard to COVID. In the South African case, at least, we've had some progressive measures where there's been a sign language interpreter during the announcement. But often, even that is not enough, right? So there's still people who are still excluded despite the fact that there's a sign language interpreter. So what we're having is a lot of people who are sitting in their houses, they can't leave, and they don't have an idea of what is happening outside of their own environment, right? So access to information, accessible information becomes such an important right at the time, right? And then we also have access to education, which you've already mentioned. A lot of people who are in high school and in tertiary education are not able to access education at this time because, to be honest, the system has not been prepared to provide education through technological or digital means, right? So we're finding that a lot of people are being left behind. As I speak, we have children returning to schools in South Africa today, and the Commission is currently monitoring how those schools are ready to bring in people back into the school environment and to ensure that they don't get infected by COVID while in the school environment, right? But it goes beyond that because it also is an issue of accessibility. How are you able to ensure that they can equally experience the education that you're providing for them? Lastly, we're also seeing access to Social Security being a huge issue. So in terms of grants, we're seeing our Department of Social Development being unable to provide grants in a timely manner. So you still have people waiting in long lines despite COVID to receive grants which amount to maybe 1,800 Rand per month, right? And they're supposed to support multiple generations usually on that income. So one thing that we're seeing is that in terms of the public sector, the readiness to use technological means to govern and monitor is something that we're falling behind on. And that in itself is leaving people behind, right? So in terms of what we need to do, I mean, even one of the things we've seen is people being abused in their homes by law enforcement officers, right? And currently government is unable to monitor the behavior of their own law enforcement officers on the ground. So this really speaks to the need for African states to emphasize and prioritize digital transformation in their own governance frameworks.
Thank you very much for that submission. And I think that you make a point which I will interpret as a question and then throw that to, well, our policy thinker on this panel. He will assume the responsibility of a government to try to help us unpack that, right? Thomas, so again, you work in policy making and policy evaluations and policy analysis. The point Alan makes is that over time, we appear not to have designed inclusive systems of policy design and policy implementation. And COVID-19 has sort of magnified that. because of that, a lot of young people have not been roped into proper policy making, because all the things that the other panelists have said so far suggest that young people are spotting problems. They are finding solutions to these problems, whether it's for people who have been marginalized, whether it's for women, whether it's for young people who are entrepreneurial and are finding innovative solutions, access to funding. They are finding pockets of solutions. If you are to wear the shoes of the government, this time you're not the person analyzing the policy, but you're the one who's supposed to be formulating the policy. And you look at the aspirations that the African continent has set for itself. And I know, Agenda 2063, for example, indicates that, we want to build this very inclusive system of policy design across the African continent. I think Alan is throwing a challenge that we don't seem to have proper systems of inclusive and participatory policy making that ropes young people into decision making, so that in a time like this, our thinking necessarily features into policy design. How would you react to that?
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for the opportunity. I do agree with Alan. I think we lack an inclusive system in Africa. Probably most African countries do not have that integrated system where anybody and different groups, whether disabled, youth, women, children from all walks of society, are integrated within the decision-making process. And mostly our states have been seriously politicized. People have become partisan across different levels. So they decide to take different political stances, support different political parties and individuals of political parties, and forget about the essential issue. The issue is about the people. And once you don't build an integrated system, focus so much on yourself and what you want and how to sustain your regime, it poses a serious problem. So the idea with having a nation or state unprepared for a challenge, the COVID-19, is apparent throughout Africa. African systems are not really inclusive. Most of these systems are exclusionary. We have systems built just around a few group of elite individuals who benefit from the system and not generally across the board. So if we want to have, for example, the AYC, the African Youth Charter that was adopted in 2006, July 2006, speaks to the fact that there must be inclusion in the decision-making process. And once we do not have a multiplicity of actors within the decision-making process, we will not have essential interests being represented. And because we have avoidance of essential interests being represented in the process, we do have a very empty political space. And because we have a very empty political space, an unrepresented political space, we always encounter problems. People make decisions. I think political decisions in Africa should be a bottom-up decision. It should be a bottom-up process, and not just one group of hierarchical people making all decisions for society. And in any society where you have unprepared systems, unready individuals, then you have people so concerned about what they think they will take from the system rather than benefiting the system, encouraging change within the system, encouraging reform within the system, we always encounter such problems. So Africa has been unprepared. It is not a new story, it's something that is quite old.
But so I'll take you up on a comment you made there, and I think maybe you can help clarify that a little bit more. So we have traditional systems that typically does not allow inclusion. You've made that point. Alan has made that point. COVID-19 is beginning to suggest to us that a lot of our activities going forward will have to be online. And I know in other jurisdictions, in some cities I've studied, in Europe, for example, look at the way the cities are organized. They leverage emerging technologies to collect citizens' views, in terms of policy making at scale. And indeed, for the young people on the African continent today, it is very easy, for instance. I mean, if you look at the northern part of the African continent today, some of the most uprisings you saw with young people being displeased about different governments, etc. The mobilization started using civic technology. Some were doing it over Facebook, some were doing it over WhatsApp and other social media platforms. So technology is beginning to play an important role. I guess the question is, given that COVID-19 appears to be pushing a lot of our activities online, what should the current system of decision making be? Is there space to say, okay, young people, you are able to mobilize yourself as activists using these tools? Are we at a point where we can mobilize your views about things that matter? People will either sign petitions, etc. But here you're talking broader policy making, right? For that border on inclusive decision making. Are we at a time where the African Union, the various African governments must recognize that this is an emergent trend and that is something we have to work on? Or as a political scientist, you think maybe I'm pushing the bar too far?
No, I think You've been read about that, and I consider that e-governance. You having a virtual program where people discuss emerging issues and solicit views and recommend important policies to government. What I basically think, what does it undermine the African Union and even policy making at national government, state parties level for quite a long period of time has been the lack of political commitment. There is a great need. I think it's important that we do that. We commit ourselves, the African leaders commit themselves to the process. We can sit on these shows, on these programs, and discuss inclusive policy making at different levels. We can talk about including all sorts of people in societal decision making. But the problem really has been, are African leaders serious enough? Are they ready enough to include these people as part of the political decision making process? The youth are enthusiastic. It's no doubt they are ready. They are driving the entire response to the COVID-19 pandemic. These are people ready for governance. These are people ready for leadership, even the women and those in other parts of society. What we do need is not just people making rhetorical statements, not just people ordering all sorts of rhetoric. We need action. And these action must come in concrete plans that are very inclusive and are very direct. And as African leaders just not trying to make any serious commitment.
Tanya, are we going to get out of this this sort of a quagmire anytime soon? I mean, you have mentioned some of the solutions that you have seen young people across the continent try to put across. Do you get a feeling that these solutions are at a point where the systems will accept them as credible solutions credible solutions for responding to the pandemic, or you still think that we still have a long way to go?
I feel like the time for action is now. This crisis has been bad, but this is the time. This is a turning point for inclusivity. I would like to touch upon what Alan said about inclusion of disabled people. They have for a long time been marginalized from decision-making processes, from economic participation in society. They haven't been able to lead an independent life per se. But with the COVID-19 crisis, as a lot of operations have moved online, remote working has expanded tremendously, and social networking has also expanded. I feel like there would be more inclusion of disabled people, especially those who have limited mobility. So this will open up a whole new ocean of possibilities for them. Likewise, I would like to touch on what Thomas said about inclusion of the voices of young people and women. There has been a long-standing narrative, I would say, of inclusion of women, of all vulnerable groups actually, in the decision-making process. And while there has been this tendency to have women or young people at the table when decisions are being made at continental level or at even regional level, there has often been tokenism. I have myself participated in meetings where I have been called to participate as a young woman. So I would for the organizers, I would be representing the voice of young people as well as the voices of young women. But even if I am given a seat at the table, my voice is not heard. I'm just there. Even if I voice out my opinions, it is just dismissed on the grounds that I am young, so I am inexperienced. I don't know the realities of the market, so I'm not wise enough to pronounce myself on certain issues. So I do feel like, exactly like Thomas said, there has to be a need for concrete action for the empowerment of those marginalized groups. Otherwise, if we just keep talking and we don't walk the talk, then there is no point in actually holding those sessions. So I feel like the crisis is an essential moment right now to change all of those narratives so that we can build a more inclusive society for all of those groups that have been oppressed for such a long time.
So we are essentially bringing young people into the conversation on African development. We are bringing young people into the fray when it comes to solutions to COVID-19. But what I hear you say is we are just ticking boxes in certain cases, just so that we are satisfied that we have included them, but not necessarily listening to the views they have. Lennon, you started off this conversation, and so I think the point Tanya makes comes back to you. You have had the opportunity of looking at the continent and how we're including young people, etc., etc. I think the point they make, which Tanya concludes on, falls squarely back on an institution, for example, like the peer review mechanism, right? because you're helping typically assess the performance of African governments and African countries and how they're keeping in time with what is going on. Given that the indication is that we're ticking boxes and not necessarily listening, what do you think we can do currently? First of all, do you agree with that assessment? And secondly, what do you think we can do to reverse that so the likes of Tanya, myself, and others can be comfortable, but going forward, even beyond COVID-19, we have a space where the voice of young people will matter at the continental level, not just having youth groups and bringing them to just check boxes. At the national level, they will matter. And at the institutional or company level, it will equally matter before we even get to the context of the family and other narratives.
So, Patrick, I do agree with Tanya that a lot of young people still feel excluded and marginalized. And that is correct throughout the continent. I recall a few years back, young people in Nigeria actually sort of worked together to force a bill for not too young to run. The law at some point excluded young people to actually run. So for me, the power is in our hands as young people. So for instance, right now, a lot of public money is going to be spent in terms of stimulus packages responding to COVID-19. And unfortunately, the ugly head of corruption is going to be all over the place. It's up for us here as young people to actually stand guard to make sure that this public money is used responsibly and transparently. So that's one very, very first thing that we can do. The next thing is for actually to push young people to get into leadership, for co-generational leadership. It's very important for us not to make noise from the outskirts of the table, the decision-making processes. We can protest as much as we want, but for as long as we don't get young people that look like us, that understand our realities and the difficulties in power, if we don't get them into power, and if we don't get them to get elected democratically, I think we still have a long way to go. So my call is actually for young people to actually get involved in the system and try to change the system from within, if possible. As you know, this year, the African Union actually has silencing the guns by 2020, which was a big goal to have silenced guns this year. And unfortunately, those guns are not silenced. So we don't want a situation by 2063, young people like us are engaging again, and we still have the same issues, Patrick. So I think it's very important for us to take responsibility where we can and actually get involved.
Tanya, are you comfortable with the responses that you have heard from, if I could say, the man who typically goes on and holds the cane and keeps everybody in check? I mean, and I'm asking that specifically because, you know, we've heard these very fine things. And for me, the question I've always asked is, should we have, leaders today who are 60 years old or more making decisions that have 50-year implications? Should they be doing that, right? Because the things you have outlined, for example, Tanya, are very short term. What can we do today to, you put the young person around the table, he matters. Let on indicate, young people, mobilize yourselves, get involved. Are you comfortable, Tanya, that the system opens up, the system will recognize that effort that you put in? And should they be thinking 50 years from today rather than focusing on what matters, within the short term?
Absolutely. Actually, I have noticed because a huge part of Africa has been colonized in the past. So a lot of our laws and our policies are remnants of colonization. And as part of the Commonwealth Youth Gender and Equality Network, I have been working on trying to reform those laws, on trying to lobby diplomats, lobby high-level officers to push governments to actually reform those laws that have for such a long time been discriminating towards people, towards women, people with disabilities, people of the LGBT community as well. So I do feel like, indeed, if we have, like Lennon said, if we have young people pushing for those reforms and actually making those who are in power at the moment see the need for those reforms, because I feel like they have not witnessed the effects of, I would say, just perpetuating those traditional laws over generations. And a lot of them, like, unfortunately, as is the situation, have tended towards corruption, if I may say so. And unfortunately, again, like Lennon said, with the huge amount of funds being disbursed to combat the COVID-19 crisis, we are going to have a rise in corruption. So indeed, now is the moment to change those laws, to reform those policies so that we can actually have an Africa that's moving forward towards more inclusivity. And one of those policies for inclusivity is also changing the educational playing field for more inclusion of those who have not been able to access education in remote areas. We have seen how education has moved towards the traditional system, from the traditional system to a more technologically based system. Unfortunately, although this has, in a certain sense, made the educational materials more accessible to those with maybe limited mobility or those who are hard of hearing, the most crucial aspect for accessibility in those cases is internet penetration. And this is a huge issue in Africa. So this is another point that young people should lobby for, because we have to admit we're privileged at the moment. We're hosting a summit and we're all in different parts of the world and we have internet connection, so we're able to get our voices heard. But what about those who don't have internet accessibility, or even if they do, they're unable to afford it? So this is an additional barrier for them to overcome. And this is just one instance of the barriers that have to be eliminated, and policy reforms and laws are the way to that equality.
Excellent feedback, Tanya. Lennon, Alan, I mean.
Yes.
So there's been a talk about a lot of money that is going to be disbursed within the time. And you look across the world. In fact, some reports I saw from the IMF has introduced the most unconventional economic principles ever that I have seen as somebody who observes economic policy closely. Mm-hmm. To the extent that, in fact, some states have given, governments blank checks on which to find solutions to the problem currently. What I want to ask you is the provision of that resource, and Lennon and Tanya have indicated that there's the possibility that may, if not accentuate, aggravate the challenges we have with corruption. In terms of the allocation of the resources that are currently being provided, do you get the feeling that the application of the resources are youth-centered? Do you get that feeling that it's centered on empowering young people, even if they are going to be corrupted? I mean, is it focused on empowering young people such that we can take the opportunities that are required and still be able to operate effectively within the current context and beyond?
I would say that my observation hasn't been an approach that is necessarily people-centered, right? So we haven't seen an approach that says, we have received this amount of money and we would like to ensure that with this money we can reduce gender-based violence in the next 5 years, or we can reduce the amount of youth who are unemployed in the country. And we're not seeing there being an accountability mechanism that's holding government accountable to that. So the answer is, we aren't seeing that people-centered focus. We are seeing economically minded focus. So what is going to impact on our GDP immediately? How are we going to grow our GDP immediately? Where are the easy gains that we can show that we have made improvements and go back and ask for more money? But on the ground, we're not seeing that much improvement. So for example, in South Africa, education is possibly the highest expenditure that we have on our budget. But we are not seeing the level of education increasing, and we're not seeing the level of people's skills increasing either. South Africa remains one of the worst countries in that. The World Economic Forum has shown that out of 140 countries, South Africa comes 130, right, in terms of education. So the mechanisms that are there to hold governments accountable for particular outcomes are really concerning. So if we look at it from a continental perspective, we have an 2063 agenda. And I have not Possibly my friends over here can add to that, but I have not seen any frameworks that are monitoring how we're going to reach any of those visions that have been put on that paper. How are we going to achieve African unity with the money that we receive? So in terms of health, I think there are frameworks that allow you to show that there are better outcomes, right? You can measure that there are better outcomes based on the amount of money that you're spending, but they are not progressive in the way they manage. They are responsive. And being responsive can often create a lot of misdirection, right? If you're not aware of where you want to go before the fact. So if we're looking at some European countries right now, some are so confident in their health sectors that they actually don't have lockdown measures. So if you look at countries like Sweden, people aren't under lockdown. They're just going on like nothing has happened because the faith in their sector is so strong. But in our context, we haven't invested so much in having our public sector being that strong. And that makes us chase every problem that we have as it arises. And that is a dangerous place to be in.
Well, thank you very much for that, As well. I think you equally touched on a very important subject. So it's not just about what resources we're making available now for that level of inclusion and empowering of young people to do things, but what we have been doing before, because that prepares us to be able to deal effectively with the crisis we have at hand. And then I think it's a very important point you make there. And you throw a question, what is happening to Agenda 2063 and what mechanisms do we have to monitor that? Because I suspect something like healthcare and, how we deal with crises like this when they come up, the other things like climate change, etc., how we deal with that. I'll go to Lemond to respond to that. But before then, I think it's important that we acknowledge some of our viewers and the questions that they are beginning to put across. And so, Lennon, take note of that question. How are you monitoring Agenda 2063 and how that document itself or that plan itself that the African continent has supports, our response to crisis like this, and what are the accountability mechanisms around that? Please think through that, and then I'll take some of the questions that we have. Very interesting questions for those of you watching us live on Facebook and the various social media handles on this platform as well. I think we want to thank you, and the questions I've seen are very interesting. There's a question from Chinedu Ogugwa, who's I suspect maybe coming from Nigeria because of the name Chinedu, and he asks that data gaps, continue to remain a challenge in Africa. How do we resolve this problem? I want to add a little bit to that. If you don't have sufficient data around investments you're making in healthcare, around young people and some of the demographics that Tanya, for example, has talked about, if you don't have that credible amount of data, how do you plan any response to this particular crisis, but most importantly, most of the other crises that we have in Africa beyond COVID-19? We've seen technology like, big ag tech. You see data, you see a lot of cloud-based technology. You've seen drones and things that are being used in farming, etc. All of these things are based on collection of data at scale in other markets we have seen. So my question will go specifically to Thomas, right? You are involved in policy making. I think you talked about some of these, but I think the question that is being asked is, you have a data problem about policy making in Africa. How do you reconcile that data difficulty going forward? How do we solve it?
I think African leaders and African government must be proactive. We need to constantly do our surveys. We need to make decisions from evidence, not just making decisions just by what we think that will appeal to our political base. In order to solve the data problem, there must be a sense of information gathering, whether digitally getting involved, engaging our people in the process, ensuring that all information is necessary in order to make political decisions. Because we do not make decisions. I'll just start the case for Liberia very quickly. And we have a demographic problem in Liberia. Since 2008, where we conducted the last census, we have not conducted any census up to 2020. So that has been a 12-year gap. And yet we are faced with a COVID-19 pandemic. How do we make such disaster preparedness decision? It's impossible. So people make decisions basically based on people to so-called political base or whatsoever you might call it. They do not base information on raw data. That's the reason why most African countries across the region face a serious problem. Most of them face serious problem in reaching decisions. We want to make decisions, but we do not know how to get the information. And we do not know how to make use of the data. Getting the data is different, and utilizing the data is another thing. And I think bulk of the idea is that in some African countries, data is available, but they do not want to use the data. Why they do not want to use the data? They want to have a cover-up. Bulk of African leaders want to do whatever they think is necessary in their own view is right to do, rather than judging from the information. And practically, this is because of their own selfish personal gain or due to other factors to play on. But I think data gap can be breached if African leaders are ready to engage more digitally and increase inclusion in the process.
Excellent point you make there. I mean, I think the use of data, collection of data, is really at the heart of policy design. And so, if people don't want to be accountable, clearly you can see that there's a break. They deliberately want to break the social contract. But I think you have some very useful pointers for us young people there. That, I mean, if we want to get involved in solutions like this, we have to start thinking creatively about how we collect our own data to back some of the reforms that we demand. There's another question from Bonolon Flatlang, I think, and I want to believe. She's from South Africa, and she has a question for Tanya. It says, Tanya, what methodologies have you used, to push different policies, laws, etc.? Because Lennon mentioned that, protesting alone is not enough to take up positions of leadership in government, right? And so, given the work that you have done, and given what we live in the continent, that generally gives political positions to families and friends, how can young people go about getting into such positions, given your work that you are currently undertaking? What advice would you have for Bonolo?
I would totally agree that at the moment it is difficult for young people to actually get involved in active politics per se and have their voices heard. And I do feel like a number of innovative solutions should be put in place, especially now when we see that young people are so vulnerable when a pandemic affects the whole continent. For example, we should have a change in our educational system. Young people don't get involved in politics because a lot of them feel like it's none of their business. Some of them don't even know the big leaders in their country. So we should start by educating them, telling them who is in power, who does what, and also not just educating them for the sake of passing exams, but actually providing them with the skills that would help them if they want to get engaged in politics. Let's just teach them conflict management. Let us teach them diplomacy. Let us teach them international world affairs so that they are knowledgeable about those from a young age, and then they can move forward and take action. And we do have young people involved in politics, not national level politics, but in universities, for example, we have student bodies, we have elections going on, we have those individuals voicing their opinions for a better life within the university compound. So why can't we use those student bodies and those young people who are making their voices heard and having a better infrastructure within their schools for those who are studying at their schools? Why not have their voices heard at national level? Why not give them a platform so that they can at least, if not be in parliament, but at least advise those who are in politics, or have a consultative meeting with those young students so that they can actually explain what are the issues that they're facing and what solutions they propose, and discuss with political leaders about the feasibility of the solutions that they're bringing forward so that they can actually come to a consensus and move forward with the policy making. And I also feel like young people don't feel like they can get involved in active politics because, let's face it, they don't have the funding that's needed to get actively involved in politics. So we could also start setting up a new system with donors or with sponsors so that they could actually get grants to get involved in politics and push forward their agendas so that they could get elected and move the voices forward.
Excellent. So there was a question from Tantu Gayude Allison, and I think his question is what you have, in your response now has touched on some of those. What concrete strategies can young people, take in order to get actively in politics or higher up authority so they can influence decision making? I think it's a very important point here. Lennon, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to the question that, Alan put to you. And I like the fact that he's asking, because if he is a civic activist, doing a lot of things for, driving human rights, etc., and he doesn't seem to see clearly what the accountability mechanisms at this continental level really looks like for fine plans like that, we have a problem.
So Alan and the viewers, first of all, that was a very good question. We still have issues when it comes to accountability. And from the work that we do at the African Peer Review Mechanism, we do country reviews, which are based on first, a country having an internal assessment of how it's been governed, and then sort of experts come in, then they double check that, and recommendations are given. Then heads of state sort of do sort of a peer review amongst each other, giving each other guidance. That's at a national level. A lot of countries have started their sort of second generation reviews. That's Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa was ready to undertake its second review. But for me, these are not just enough, because these are recommendations. It's up to us as citizens, because as a young man working for a continental organization, I hear a lot of insults. At times you hear that African Union is a toothless dog that barks, that makes a lot. But the African Union is us. So let's not insult the continental organization. Let's do things that will make sure that the continental organization sort of works properly. Bring our leaders into account. Then at a continental level, there is the Africa Governance Report, which I wish our viewers and fellow panelists get opportunity to look at. At about by annual level now, the African Peer Review Mechanism is now producing what's called the Africa Governance Report, which sort of showcase sort of at a continental level the situation on governance. And the last one that came out last year, the first governance report, showcased that despite all the challenges that we have, we've actually made strides from back in the 80s. You remember the so-called hopeless, the lost decade, where we had coup d'etats, where we had civil wars. We've made a little bit of progress. So let's not just look, we do have sort of issues, but we've made strides, and it's up to us young people to take responsibility, to have the agency to actually take our continent forward. Instead of crying out, let's move away from political apathy, get involved. When there's an election, go and vote.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I think you sort of summarized what our expectations should be, but I think my own question will then be, there are these fine things that may not necessarily be comprehensive accountability mechanisms, but how is the union itself or the continental body, driving advocacy so the continent can know, or the people of the continent can know what it is that is happening, and how they as citizens can independently hold their governments to get accountable. I think in responding to that, you want to tie your response to that to a question that has been asked by one of our viewers from home, and that is Lilia Sarah. I hope I'm getting the name right. It says, how can African countries behave together to face this pandemic, right? How do we work together to face this pandemic? And I think that equally comes back to the issue of communication and disaster. We're running out of time. You can just cut that short for us.
So at the moment, you have the chairmanship of the African Union with the government of South Africa. So you have President Cyril Ramaphosa as the chair, and you have him speaking to his fellow African heads of states in terms of having a coordinated response to COVID-19. He has held several meetings with fellow heads of states. That's the first one. Then you have what you call the African Center for Disease Control, which is actually today is actually fundraising with African musicians. I encourage young people to actually get involved with that project. In terms of mobilizing young people on the continent, particularly young musicians, to raise funds for the continent. So these are some of the few interventions that I've seen. You also have philanthropists that are coming in, donating, as well as at a national level, there are sort of funds that are being opened where citizens can actually donate money to sort of fight COVID-19. So those are the few things that I can mention for now.
Fantastic. And so, again, we still have a gap on how we rope, the broader African continent into the bigger conversation of accountability. communication and what needs to be done and what not. Useful intervention there. Tanya, there seems to be a lot of questions for you, which means that uh, people are generally concerned and they're really interested in the strategies that you keep mentioning in terms of how we can rope different people in and get young people involved. But I have a question for yourself and Thomas, and you can both try to make the responses short. We have talked about some of that, but now I want concrete strategies, right? Civic activism, young people mobilizing themselves. There's a lot of poverty all across Africa, and poverty is one of the reasons why people end up become very tokenist. So that when they are given an opportunity to get involved in politics, or they're given a seat at the table, even during a time like this, they themselves as young people, maybe you, Tanya, you're an exception, but for most of them, it is really not a case of let me go and offer a solution. It is either they are being very, paying attention to their tribes that they're coming from. So either they belong to a particular political party or a particular sector of society that gives them an opportunity. In terms of concrete steps, yourself and Thomas, I mean, what do you think young people can do in this area? And I'll start with Thomas and end with you, Tanya.
Basically, what I think is that young people have the immense capacity. I would like to quote from the African Youth Charter, the preamble of the African Youth Charter, that says we convinced that Africa's greatest resource is the young people.
Yeah.
When it comes to the young people, what I basically think is that young people can start up by getting themselves reoriented. We need a reorientation of the minds of young people. It's important that young people get engaged in the politics, but it's not just about getting engaged in the politics. It's getting engaged in the politics with the right mindset. We have very terrible political development, political socialization. People have different mentality about politics. The system has been institutionally corrupt. So we need young people with a different set of strategies and different set of mind. So young people should be reoriented firstly, and young people should try to get the system changed and believe in themselves with values. We need values. We need convictions. We need that sense of Pan-African identity. We need people to own their societies and own their development, and they will take positive actions. So we have a wider space of inclusion, wider space of people interacting, but we do not just need youth to sit down and just feel convenient as though everything is okay. And state parties and even the African Union have their own part to play. I'll start to catalog it firstly from the African Union. I think the African Union, like I want to contend what Lennon said, African Union has not done enough. African Union has not harmonized enough with sub-regional organizations. The African Union has been essentially weak in coordinating African countries, despite all of these virtual meetings that have been going on. We have not seen a concerted effort both from the African CDC and from other bodies. And that's when we come to national parties and state parties, national governments. National governments have been weakened because they were not essential strategies. So getting young people involved from the very stage of disaster preparedness, disaster engagement, we can find a different channel, different change in national government. We need such transition, and such transition must start with reorientation, reevaluation, civic engagement, re-education, reform of existing policies, and we'll definitely see the change that we want.
Fantastic. In fact, I'm almost lost for words having listened to you. You've also outlined a lot of challenges and difficulties, and I'm hoping Tanya will unpack that for us. Tanya.
Yes, I would like to
credible strategies for us to get involved. So when we get involved, it's not just a case of tokenist or being appreciative of the system saying, look, you have an opportunity to sit at the table. And I say this particularly with the example of the former African Union ambassador to the UN. You know, I think she, in my opinion, made one of the most boldest statements in terms of having a seat at the table, right, and aiming to change what the status quo is. But some people disagree with what the opposition. We know what the ramifications are. So what examples can we as young people truly follow? And what can we do in order to prepare ourselves to get a seat at the table so we don't end up succumbing to the system and the system sucking us in?
I do agree that we indeed need a seat at the table because representation is important. I myself grew up, and when I was a child, I grew up not seeing any women like me in power, in politics, or making their voices heard. So I grew up thinking that I don't have a space in there. I would never get there. So when I got into my teenage years, then I started seeing women making their voices heard. I started seeing women in politics, in positions of power, in business. So then it changed my way of thinking, and I realized that yes, if they can do it, that means women can also do that. So representation indeed is important. That being said, it is not the only criteria to make your voice heard, and representation doesn't mean action. So if you might have a youth representative at the table, and that person may be, let's just say, be able to make their voices heard, but does that mean that complete action is going to be taken? We need all the stakeholders to understand the ramifications of that young person's ideas and suggestions. So even if we don't have a lot of young people in power, it doesn't mean that we cannot make our leaders understand the need for reform and have young people's interest at heart. They might have been in power. Our leaders at the moment, most African leaders might have been in power for a long time, and they have been going on with the same ideologies for years, if not decades. But that doesn't mean that we cannot push for changes. We cannot try to make them understand our perspective and work in harmony with their experience and our enthusiasm combined, so that we can have a holistic development for the continent. And speaking about representation, I saw a question from Shalom, and I would like to address that. The question was, why is there just one female panelist? And again, this comes about representation. I do feel like, yes, I might be the only woman on the panel at the moment, but with all due respect to my other colleagues, I don't feel like they are, just because they are men, they won't be able to advocate for women's rights. You don't have to be a woman to understand that we need equality. Just because I am able doesn't mean I cannot work for the rights of disabled people. Just because someone is not Black doesn't mean they don't understand the plight of Black people. So yes, representation is important, but it's about time we change that narrative that it's only a woman who can fight for the rights of other women. Men have to be a part of the fight equally, and I do believe that men have a huge part to play in changing the mindset that has been perpetuated over generations and generations in Africa. So unless we evolve from that mindset that only women can advocate for, like only a representative of a certain group can advocate for the needs of that group, there's not going to be any incremental change for that minority group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And I think on the very last point, I think what you say is actually quite potent, because I think there are different, because of the principle of intersectionalism, I think we have a collective responsibility to all respond to, issues of development and issues of inclusivity from different points. But I think that for the conveners of this forum, it is not deliberate that we want to get a panel that is imbalanced in terms of its gender composition. I think we tried to get a very fair representation on the panel in terms of the panelists outside of myself, but circumstances beyond control led to that. But I don't think any of the panelists here have like you indicated, have not been forthright in representing the views of all the young people we have on the continent. But I think the point that is equally raised is very important, because again, we cannot be demanding these things of our leaders and not be representative. I think my final question will go to you, Alan, and it's fortunately it's a question coming from Durban in South Africa, right? And that's a question from Tabiso Mapisa. Now he makes the point that you spoke of the need of not only responsive frameworks, and he's talking about frameworks of governments and their sensitivity to policy design and budget funding, etc. Is the problem not having responsible parties that ensure that the frameworks you put together are progressive, or is it just a case of focusing on never solving the problem itself by just ticking boxes? So we do a framework because we want to tick boxes, not because we want to be progressive in solving a solution. And if that is the problem, he's asking you, how do you think what can we do to solve this problem?
I think that the problem lies in there being no problem with you not meeting a target and you not solving the problem. So it's a bit of both. But if you don't solve the problem, nothing will happen to you as a leader, as a president. You will finish your term and go and retire nicely with some security guards in a nice house somewhere on the coast, right? But the point is, currently there's nothing that holds people to achieving those things. So to a large extent, people might not understand the problem, right? How do we solve this problem? We require 1, 2, 3. There isn't that discussion. There's a tendency to kind of throw money at the issue and say, okay, if we dedicate this amount of money to it, then surely you will solve the problem. And when you come back at the end of the year and you show that you've spent your money in such a way, then they're satisfied that perhaps you haven't solved the problem, but you've spent the money in an active way, right? So there needs to be a lot more management of consequences, right? So we need to understand that there are consequences to not achieving certain things, right? I want to pause there because I just want to take an opportunity to finally just add a different perspective to the issue of activism from the youth, if I may, Patrick.
Oh, definitely. You can go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, so obviously the whole thing of being in participation and being represented in these frameworks has been already spoken about. But I think maybe one thing we haven't spoken about is the role that stigma plays in the plight of youth, right? I believe there's still a huge stigma revolving the capability of a person who's youth to lead, right? So we still have this view that is traditional that you must be old or you must have gray hairs in order to have wisdom, in order to have the ability or capability to be a leader, right? And that is something that really does stop us from making a difference, regardless of what table you sit at. If the other person at the table is looking at you and saying, you're too young to understand the dynamics, then nothing's going to change, right? And I just want to give context to this. Between the 50s and 60s, when countries had gotten their independence, there was huge debates amongst Kwame Nkrumah and the leaders as to how Africa should unite, right? Should it be an immediate thing? Should we let go of our borders and unite immediately? Or should we do it progressively from the bottom up? So Julius Nyerere was the arguer to say, let's go bottom up. And obviously he had won the argument, right? But Kwame Nkrumah, his point was that what is going to stifle us in the end is our traditional society, right? Not because they're backward, but because they won't want to let go of the power that they themselves have in order to allow Africa to unite, right? And 50, 60 years on, we're seeing this affecting us on a daily basis, right? The views, the place that youth are placed in society is really the problem, and we must start to reconsider our traditional ways of doing things.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I think it's a very good note on which we will close this session. I know there's a lot of questions that are still coming in. If you're watching us live on any of our social media handles for this particular summit, please keep the conversation going. It doesn't end here. We're just supposed to kickstart, an online conversation around these issues that are very relevant to the development of young people in the country. But to my panelists, Lennon, Alan, Tanya, and Thomas, I want to thank you for making time to having this conversation with us, regardless of where you're coming from. And I hope for you, the viewers, at least at the end of this conversation, we've tried to demystify what youth activism in Africa looks like in the face of the COVID 2019, whether there are challenges, and what opportunities exist in there. I hope we've also been able to discuss some strategies that help you understand the position of young people as far as the African Union Youth Charter is concerned. I think and Thomas from Liberia touched on a number of issues in there as well, and what that means for strategies, for strategy provision and solutions in COVID-19, dealing with COVID-19. Again, I hope we've been able to answer questions around the respective lockdown restrictions that you have seen across the countries, and how young people have been innovative in providing solutions to dealing with that. I think Tanya and Alan talked about a number of those, and I think they're coming from two different perspectives by breaking down borders Africa. Please do make time and join any of those conversations as and when notifications come through. My name is Patrick Stevenson from Accra, Ghana, and I've been your host of this conversation. Thank you, and to my panelists.
Patrick, I'm sorry to interrupt. Before we close, I would like to say to anyone that is watching, all of our attendees and everyone whose questions we haven't been able to answer, if you want to connect with us outside of the summit, please feel free to do so. Our social media handles are on the Breaking Down Borders Africa Facebook page. You can find us there, and then we'll just take it from there to LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, however you want to connect. Please feel free to follow us.
Fantastic, Tanya.
I would like to come in with an important point, just something quickly as my parting comment.
Fair enough. Quickly, and then we can wrap up.
Okay, that's good. I want all African youths to understand that there is no single definition of the African problem. It's a continuous debate. As we celebrate Africa Day, African liberation, the foundation of the organization African Unity, the predecessor of the African Union. Debate started immediately after they won their independence, immediately after colonialism, the post-colonial era. Debate started about how to govern Africa, and some were enthusiastic about getting involved. But the question is not about getting involved. The question is, are you prepared to get involved? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think you closed us on a much better note than I would. On that note, I say bye-bye to everybody and thank you for joining.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.